There's this part in the 2006 movie Marie Antoinette, directed by Sofia Coppola, where she finds out that her sister in law got pregnant before her. For a bit of context here, in the 18th century, for royal families, producing heirs was a whole production, right? It was like a crucial political and social obligation. The birth order of the children meant so much to these families. Obviously, the firstborn, the first heir, the first son determined the line of succession to the throne. So if a younger sibling, such as Marie Antoinette's sister in law, were to give birth before her, as she does in the film and in real life, it would significantly impact the order of succession and potentially challenge Marie Antoinette's future role as queen consort. In the film, Marie Antoinette and her family were concerned about what the birth of her nephew would mean to the friendship between Austria and France. So there was this one scene where Marie Antoinette, who was brilliantly and empathetically played by Kirsten Dunst, it's one of my favorite characters of her ever. Marie Antoinette is in this cream and pink satin dress. She walks through Versailles amidst whispers from people around her, sort of like almost jeering at her and almost resentful that the nephew was born before she could give them an heir. And she just about closes the door to her own private quarters, and suddenly the huge pressure of not just giving birth, but giving birth to a son and also potentially keeping the peace in her region just starts to destroy her. She absolutely just breaks down in tears. She's weeping very audibly and quite dramatically, sort of slides down the walls with Baroque decorated wallpaper, and she just falls apart. She just cries. And then the camera zooms out and we see that she's in this sort of like fetal position in the corner, like a child. That scene, I think, for anybody who has ever tried and failed at something, but most specifically, I think for like eldest daughters of any household who has this much pressure and expectations set before them that they couldn't quite achieve, this was a very poignant and relatable moment. Hi, welcome back to A Love Letter to. Thank you guys so much for being so patient while I got my shit together. But I'm here now with a love letter to a movie that I first watched as a 17-year-old with chicken pox on my bed with my pink snuggie, which, as it turned out, was the perfect time to see Marie Antoinette. And I say that because no one does Girlhood as well as Sofia Coppola. This is one of my favorite movies of all time, and in my opinion really does a great job with humanizing Marie Antoinette and sort of allows us to view her as just another girl that has sort of been thrust into this position of influence and power that she didn't necessarily ask for. It's not that she's faultless, obviously, but I do think that history has perhaps judged her far too harshly. So today, we'll dive deep into Marie Antoinette and girlhood and what it means for a queen to come of age. Stay with me. Let's talk costumes. So the costume for Marie Antoinette was designed by Milena Canonero, and it won the Academy Award for Best Costume Design in 2006. This was absolutely no mean feat because the nominations at that time were robust. She was going up against The Devil Wears Prada, designed by the legendary, the icon Patricia Field, and also Dreamgirls, and those are just two of the nominations at that time. So obviously, objectively, the costuming for this film was very, very good. But before diving into the more sort of metaphorical and symbolic elements that I took away from the costuming of this movie, I think it's important to understand how great it is just on a technical basis. Obviously, there were inaccuracies here and there, which were actually added for narrative purposes and for the purpose of bringing Sofia Coppola's vision to life. But aside from those, Everything that Milena Canonera designed were period accurate, which is why when you look at old portraits and, paintings of Marie Antoinette from that era, especially the ones from she was way younger, the ones that were painted when she had just arrived in France, you can see where the design elements come from, the pastels, the bows, the lace. In 2024, we maybe will call that coquette. It's very coquette girly. In this movie, we also see the traditions of dressing in a French court in the 1700s. I'm thinking about the sequence where she wakes up in her and Louis's bedroom for the first time, and the protocol was that the highest ranked person in the room gets the privilege of helping her get dressed. And so then, as more and more people come in the room, each with a higher rank than the other, she must wait in the cold, completely naked. This movie visually is like sweet saccharine rococo in its highest form. It is so sweet, so pastel, the clothes look like you could eat them. But all this was on purpose. Sofia Coppola herself explains that in doing this, she was interested in showing, quote, the real human being behind the myths. So, capturing in the design the way in which Sophia imagined the essence of Marie Antoinette's spirit. The film's candy colors, its atmosphere, the teenage music, they have this sort of pop rock soundtrack. All of that are meant to reflect and to evoke how Sophia saw that world from Marie Antoinette's perspective. But there's a specific part in the movie that I wanted to highlight. So, as I've alluded to earlier, for much of the film, Marie Antoinette is stressed out about getting pregnant. That's like her one goal. And at one point, her sister-in-law, the Countess of Provence, Maria Josephine, who in the movie clearly had a much better and healthier sex life than her, becomes pregnant. Not only that, but she gives birth to a baby boy. So this is the sequence that I described at the beginning of the show. Marie Antoinette then had to save face and go to the birth of the child and smile and coo and whatever else we do when the new baby is born. But behind closed doors, the hurt and the pain, I'm sure if somebody else in your life got something that you really, really wanted, seeing other people living your dream, that sucks. And not only does she now have to cry about her inability to have a child and her lack of sexual or any sort of romantic chemistry with her husband, she also now has to deal with this even more enormous pressure that was put upon her, all the while she's dealing with the loneliness that comes with being an Austrian in a French court in 18th century France, So how does she try to make herself feel better? Well, she goes on a huge shopping spree. Here in the movie, there's that quintessentially sort of early 2000s shopping sequence. Wigs and gowns and gloves and shoes and hair pieces. And we see her in the most ostentatious wig yet that is about as tall as her torso. Just this pure decadence with champagne flowing and little pastries and little macarons. In this sequence, Milena Canonera's work, in my opinion, had the opportunity to just shine, and I love it. The movie, to me, really encapsulates the phrase eye candy in costume form. As the movie goes on, we see her in a series of summer and winter gowns, each overly decorated and embellished, usually in pastels and florals, and very textured. There's a lot going on in these clothes. Even the black gown that she wears when her child dies still has that quintessential Marie Antoinette Rococo look. And it's this sort of attention to detail and the consistency and commitment to the look that makes this movie so good. Up next, I dive into two elements of the costuming that were, in my opinion, very important in the viewing experience of the film. That's up in a minute. So if you're watching this movie and you're really looking at the clothes, you really see that powder blue is a very important motif for Marie Antoinette. So let's take it back to the beginning. We meet her as a 14-year-old in her Austrian palace. Her costume here is very childlike. Even the way that she's walking is very childlike. She's in this unadorned high neck blue gown. Her blonde hair is flat and volumeless, and she has a bow on her hair. She has no jewelry, and she's cradling her pet pug like it's a teddy bear. She almost looks sort of like an Alice in Wonderland type of character. She's walking to see her mother, the Queen of Bohemia, Maria Theresa, for what would be, I assume, the last time. She is traveling after this meeting to the border between Austria and France to start her journey in marrying King Louis XVI. And she's doing this to seal an alliance between the two countries, which traditionally had a rivalry. This was straight after the Seven Years' War that was fought primarily in Europe and the Americas and the diplomatic revolution of 1756. This is a deep, deep, deep cut in history, and I'm not even gonna pretend like I know what this was all about, but if you're interested, girl, go Google it. But I raised that just to paint a picture of where Marie Antoinette was walking into at this time. She's heading into this marriage to seal the alliance between France and Austria. And there's that side by side juxtaposition, shall we say, of it, right? Of this very serious, very grown up business with a small 14-year-old girl who just likes to be with her pet and her friends. You know, in the carriage going to the border, she's with her friends or her sisters, I'm not sure, and she's showing a painting of her future husband, King Louis XVI, like how a teenage girl today would like show a text from their crush to their friends and like giggle about it. We see her wear a handmade friendship bracelet, and even later on, someone from the French party whispers at the meeting she looks like a child, which further highlights how young she was. At the border, there was this sort of symbolic handover of her going from Austrian to French soil, and she's stripped off of her old clothes and belongings, including, very sadly, her little pug. In this sequence, she goes from this very white, unadorned, unassuming dress into this powder blue dress that is the exact same shade of powder blue as the first gown we saw her in, but much more adorned. There's loads of lace, and her hair is up and in curls, and she has numerous layers underneath, and ruffles and bows and feathers. Among all this, most importantly, it's very French. In her most vulnerable moments, we see Marie Antoinette in a powder blue gown. There was the sequence that starts with her sending off her husband before a hunting trip, where she all but begs him to get her pregnant. And in this sequence, after the whole parade of like beautiful dresses, she's back in this simple powder blue gown, which, although is still quite French, is nowhere near as over the top as the rest of her gowns. She's back in this powder blue color we were introduced to her in the beginning. In my view, it sort of calls to mind the helplessness and the youth that Marie Antoinette had, but I think that blue and that specific shade also sorts of mirror something that follows her for most of the film, which is the want of a male heir. I think that when we see Marie Antoinette in a powder blue gown, it's sort of a visual clue that she's the most her, the realest version of her. We see her in it again when she's hungover the day after a party, and we see this listlessness that is very standard of any hungover. Or straight after the scene where her lover leaves and she's feeling dissatisfied and misses him, and it sort of imagines him very heroically fighting a war. And then she's in it again when she says goodbye to her best friends as the revolution starts. And when finally the end arrives and the mob gets to Versailles in the middle of the night, she's wearing a white nightgown. Yes, but what's embellishing it? A powder blue ribbon, right? The final gown we see her in then at the very end eating dinner with her husband is a powder blue gown with minimal decoration. Certainly nothing like what we've become accustomed to for the past 2 hours, almost similar to the one that we see her in her first day in French soil. On one part of the film, Marie Antoinette becomes obsessed with cottagecore. She receives the Petit Trianon as a gift and sort of fancied herself living in a more simple way. And I say simple way with quotes. So she says here that she wanted something simple and natural to wear in the garden. And she starts sort of like cosplaying as a peasant girl from the fields. She's gardening, she's taking care of goats, she's harvesting eggs from the chicken, she's, drinking fresh milk. It's a sort of very idyllic pastoral life that doesn't have any of the actual hardships that farmers and actual people who live in rural villages at the time would have experienced in this part of France's history, because obviously everyone was starving. It really reminded me of that cottagecore trend that sort of happened during the start of the pandemic. So this whole section of the film is a marked contrast from the overindulgence that she had been taking part in all movie. We learned then from her assistant that amidst all the austerity and poverty in France, she's been spending so much money in making this small life in the village happen, to the point where she actually does play one on stage in a theatrical production where she stars and sings and uses a broom as a prop to sweep nothing on stage. I'm a bit torn about this because on one hand, I'm like, can we really blame her from trying to have this different life happen for her? She didn't ask for any of this, and clearly she needed a break from the court life. However, at the same time, there's this obvious ignorance and disinterest in what's happening in her country as a war is raging in America and the people of France is going hungry. There's a portrait of her during this era that exists in the real world. You can see and visit it at Versailles, but it's also shown in the film, of course, with the face of Kirsten Dunst in it. It's called, well, there's two versions of the painting. One is Marie Antoinette en gaule, or Marie Antoinette in a chemise, and she's covered shoulder to toe, but it's a chemise dress, which at the time was technically a sort of a form of underwear. She was wearing no jewelry, and people were so shocked because they thought it was far too revealing and not right for a queen of France to be portrayed in this kind of dress. And it was also supposed to be made from imported cotton, which also angered people because at this time the French silk industry was struggling. So the painter Louise Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun painted a new portrait that was essentially the same, except now the queen was wearing a more sort of classic blue silk robe, more befitting of a queen, as it were. That first painting with the chemise was painted only 10 years before Marie Antoinette was beheaded, which tells you a lot about people's feelings towards her at this time. Up next, we're gonna zoom out a little bit and talk about Sofia Coppola and her relationship with Girlhood. Be back in a minute. Sofia Coppola, if you lived through the Tumblr Rookie Mag era as a teenager, I'm thinking like early 2010s, maybe it peaks in 2014, but it's definitely gone by 2016. She was sort of, an off the time director of that movement. And I would say actually gave birth creatively to people like Petra Collins, for example. I definitely used to be obsessed with the movie The Virgin Suicides, which is an adaptation of the book by Jeffrey Eugenides that was directed then by Sofia Coppola. That and Lost in Translation, which isn't about a teenager, but I think still encapsulates that feeling of listlessness and sort of boredom and angst that teenagers can identify with. These movies shaped my whole personality. But there's a new movie that Sofia Coppola released after I was a teenager that I still haven't seen, and that is, of course, Priscilla. This is the story of Elvis Presley's first wife, Priscilla Presley, who she met when she was 14 and Elvis was 24. So with a filmography like this, it's so clear that girlhood is a theme that is sort of bread and butter for Sofia Coppola, and I, for one, am so behind it. The reason why is because I think that for her, the specifics of being a girl is for once celebrated, instead of dismissed. Like things like daydreaming and looking at cute things and being into stuff that other people would say is frivolous. As I mentioned earlier with Marie Antoinette and the shopping scene where they shop for pants and shoes while eating food. That's like every teenage girl's dream. In Marie Antoinette, there were these constant reminders of how young she is outside of the costumes even. For example, her penmanship when she gets married to King Louis was like scrawled by a child and had this like ink stain at the very end. And then when King Louis XV dies, the first thing Marie Antoinette's husband, King Louis XVI, says is, "Dear God, please protect us. We are too young to reign." I think a lot of people who see this movie critique like the accent and the affect and the use of poppy rock music in a movie about 18th century France, in a movie that's supposed to be like a period film, I guess. But I do actually think that it drives the point home a lot more. I really appreciate how the movie brings to our attention how much like any other teenage girls Marie Antoinette was, who also was obviously in this very privileged environment, more than privileged, you know, as the next queen of France. She has had so much of that freedom taken from her that, in my opinion, all teenage girls should be afforded with and deserve. This has been a love letter too. I'm your host, Danielle Olavario. Thank you so much for being so patient, waiting for me to end my, shall we say, extended hiatus. But worry not, you will see me again next week when I will be talking about the Academy Award winner for Best Costume Design in 2023, Poor Things. I can't wait. I'm really looking forward to that next week. But until then, give us a follow on our socials at A Love Letter to Podcast on everything. We're even on TikTok, we're on Instagram. And if you enjoyed this episode, do leave us a review wherever you're listening. It really does help the show. And, you know, feel free to send me a love DM as well at Danielle Olavario on Instagram about what you think of this episode and what movies you want me to go through next. Bye!